Thank you, Kathleen, for the introduction. And I was just saying that very pleased to see that under the new leadership of Rick Smith, the Broadbent Institute moving to discuss further discussion about the necessary shift that Canada needs to make towards a greener economy, a more sustainable future. So with that in mind, you don't have to look very far to see evidence in the global economy that a transition is underway, both here and abroad. So I'll just point out a few examples from the past few weeks. In China, in anticipation of establishing a national carbon market, has now for the first time required thousands of companies to start reporting their CO2 emissions. This is a huge deal in that a lot of these are large, sort of state-owned or state-affiliated industries, heavily polluting. You need to change the institutional culture at these companies, and so this is a big deal. On the green bonds front, just yesterday, TD announced $500 million green bond issuing. Unilever, Toyota as well announced billions of dollars in green bonds over the past week. And the Unilever one was particularly interesting because it was not issued to fund a specific green product or launch, but to actually audit their supply chain and to bring out greater efficiencies, greater resource efficiencies. So the idea that green bonds could be picking up steam in the private sector for various different, for reasons that hadn't originally been used for or foreseen is very positive. We have Elon Musk, which Mariana talked about a little bit, the CEO of Tesla. Tesla's been in the news recently, but one that really received only a little bit of coverage in the sort of sustainability community was this big plan to build by 2017 the largest lithium-ion battery factory in the world. And so it is going, the plan, at least if everything goes well, is to build more lithium-ion batteries than are produced in the entire world right now. And so this has potentially wide-ranging effects on energy storage for renewable energy technologies, and obviously his main goal is to drop the price considerably for electric vehicles. But you know, all these are very exciting. And then you have ExxonMobil, and perhaps the biggest development, decided to, under rather strong pressure from investors and particularly institutional investors, to announce a strategy to combat, or rather a plan to address the idea of their exposure to unburnable carbon, which is pretty much this idea that there's a finite amount of carbon that we can burn in the world before we reach our 2 degrees Celsius increase in global warming, which the International Panel on Climate Change is deemed to be a very dangerous level. And so with a company like ExxonMobil, if they hold way more reserves at present and they're exploring more reserves every day, the oil and gas industry spent over $800 billion on exploration last year, and yet they're expanding out these resources that ultimately, in many cases, can't be used. And so ExxonMobil felt the pressure enough that they actually needed to release a plan as to how they're going to deal with that. I don't think the plan's going to be great, but the fact that they're acknowledging the pressure was a big deal. In the past year and a half, we've had the heads of the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD all speak out in the strongest terms possible about the need for an immediate transition to a greener economy. You know, this is important because they're not exactly viewed as radical institutions. You look at Christine Lagarde, the former finance minister in the conservative government in France. She said that we're going to be toasted, fried, and griddled if we don't deal with climate change. And so it's striking that not only these are bastions of hardly bastions of radical thought, but that they're often viewed as representing mainstream economic views. So in Canada, we had this week the Premier of Manitoba was going around pitching his $11 billion plan to increase hydro power generation in the province and build increasing transmission lines down south, which would bring more clean electricity or emissions-free electricity to Minnesota and Wisconsin. Wisconsin in particular, a big coal state, and so that could help those states potentially meet renewable energy portfolio standards, bring in some revenue for Canada, and so that's a win-win. And yet, when we look at the state of public discourse in Canada over this transition to a green economy, we find that proponents are generally on their back foot. They're in a full defensive mode. the detractors have been very successful at selling this argument that it's an either-or proposition, that it's a binary choice, that either we can have economic growth and prosperity, or we can protect the environment. We can have oil sands development and create jobs, or you're anti-industry. And the tough economic climate that we're in has exacerbated this, in that people are less willing to hear this argument if it's going to cause some uncertainty, and if it could potentially affect them. And so you can see how opponents to any green shift would jump on this and say, well, I like the idea in the abstract of having more renewable energy, but what's it going to do for me? This has been made harder by proponents of this shift, often using an ethical or moral argument, in that it's our imperative for future generations to push for action on climate change, as opposed to what's the economic case. So, what is the economic case for making this transition to a green economy? Name of the panel. What does this transition look like? And what are the best policy tools to help facilitate this within Canada? Does it involve a carbon price? Is a price on carbon enough, or is that just the tip of the iceberg and all sorts of other policy tools are needed? To develop this idea further, does a carbon price talk out or crowd out discussion of other equally important tools at our disposal? And we certainly shouldn't forget the important role that the private sector and civil society will play in this transition. So with these questions in mind, I'd like to introduce each of our panelists today. We have our first panelist is Clare Demerse. She's the Director of Federal Policy at the Pembina Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank focused mainly on energy issues, based out of Calgary, and she also serves as a Broadbent Fellow.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So hopefully my mic is on. So as we just heard, the question guiding this panel is, what's the economic impetus for building a green economy in Canada? And I think the short answer is, frankly, because any other option is too risky. Not just environmentally, which is my day job, but economically too. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the risks that we're running today. And I think you could fairly describe the federal government's current approach as essentially going all in on oil and gas development. As just one example that we heard, I guess, in Ed's speech this morning, the political capital that the government has been spending on promoting the Keystone XL pipeline project in Washington. And I think partly because of that emphasis from our federal government, there's this perception out there that Canada's economic future is all about fossil fuels. So we often hear, the oil sands is the engine of our economy, this is our meal ticket, it's going to be developed come hell or high water. So a bit of context on that. Despite its rapid growth, the oil sands sector today represents 2% of Canada's GDP, and it employs just 0.2% of Canada's workers. So for comparison, the manufacturing sector, for example, directly employs over 25 times more Canadians. Environmentally, though, this sector does punch well above its weight. Even if we set aside, the land, water, air, wildlife impacts on the ground in Alberta, and look at the carbon pollution causing climate change, the oil sands is a powerhouse. So the Environment Canada analysis says, this is our fastest growing sector in terms of the growth in greenhouse gas pollution. Emissions are expected to triple from 2005 to 2020. And in the course of that, oil sands emissions growth is enough to undo the progress that other parts of our economy are projected to make in reducing their own emissions. So the other thing, environmentally, that's comparing to Canada's national emissions profile, but if you compare it to its peers, even crudes, heavy crudes produced in Mexico or Venezuela, this is a high carbon fuel. So what does that mean? Turning to that question about the green transition that is guiding our panel, if countries around the world take more steps to tackle climate change, obviously one of the things you're going to see is policy choices that reduce demand for oil. more investment in public transit, more support for electric vehicles, regulations that give preference to cleaner fuels, all of that basket of policies. So for example, if you look at the International Energy Agency's Safe Climate scenario, in that scenario, they will see global demand for oil peaking in 2020 and dropping after that. US oil demand is already dropping today. And basic economics tells us that lower demand means lower prices. So if you're sitting on a high-cost, high-carbon source of fuel like the oil sands, lower prices means lower development, lower production. So if countries do start to take climate change seriously, that inevitable oil sands development that we've all heard so much about actually starts to look a lot more fragile than we usually see it today. Essentially, the sector's ambitious growth plans require the future to look a lot like the past, right? Minimal climate regulations, high oil prices, access to pipelines, and maybe more than anything else, voracious demand for the product. So I would argue a more likely future, and luckily also a better one, is one where we make that transition to clean energy. And as you're going to hear about from everybody here, right, that transition is well underway today. Over 1.5 trillion invested in the global clean energy sector to date. In some markets, technologies like wind and solar are already cost competitive with the fossil alternatives. And here in Canada, we see a vibrant Cleantech sector, despite the lack of a national carbon price that would help spur that along. So I would say at this point in Canada, we've got a couple of options. One is we can choose to build that resilient, diversified, clean energy economy that can compete successfully in a low-carbon world. Or we can run the risk of sinking billions more into infrastructure for oil sands production that the world's markets may ultimately not want. So making that clean energy transition, I would argue, is the safer economic choice for Canada, even before we look at the risks that we would run economically from climate change itself. So what do we need to do? Just to quickly wrap up on that. I would argue we need to start with less short-term thinking. A fossil fuel exporter like ours can be a winner in a global clean energy transition, but only if we start to think longer term. We also need to stop treating climate policy as a zero-sum game. Oil and gas sector uses renewables too. In fact, it uses a lot of them. This isn't just about a simple winners-losers transition, as our moderator was referring to. We need federal regulation with teeth on oil and gas sector greenhouse gas emissions. We also need to be willing to say no to resource development projects when regulators find significant environmental impacts or when public support isn't there. We obviously need more carbon pricing, as I think you're going to hear from a lot of us. We need more investment in renewable energy, energy efficiency, smart urban design, more financing for clean technology, and more of those transformative, marquee, clean energy projects that get people really excited about that transition. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claire. Next, we have Chris Ragan, who's an associate professor at the Department of Economics at McGill University. He is also a research fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute in Toronto, and he pens a thoughtful column in the Globe and Mail that I would recommend seeking out.
Thank you. So let me begin by saying I'm not the usual person to sit here. I'm a macroeconomist. I'm not an environmentalist. I'm not an environmental economist. So if you understand what macroeconomics is, then you'll have some sense of where I come from, at least on this issue. I want to make 4 quick points. Number one is that I think we shouldn't be speaking only about a green economy. I think green is not enough. And I think actually it's too easy to get a green economy if you're prepared to dispense with the other elements of prosperity. Okay? I think the better goal for all of us is that we should be striving for a better economy, and I would say that there's 2 essential aspects of a better economy. One is that we have better protection of our environmental assets of all types, and I will not focus on carbon only. There are many elements to a green economy that frankly have nothing to do with carbon. So I think we need a better protection of our environmental assets, and I think we also want an economy that is more innovative and with higher productivity growth. Those are the things that you would expect a macroeconomist to say on innovation and productivity growth, but I think we need the two things together. And Ed Broadbent this morning, actually, I think made exactly this point, that we have to stop pitching one against the other. There are many people who think you can only have a greener economy by having less of the other things, and other people who think we can have more of the innovation and prosperity, but only by having a less green economy. I think that's fundamentally wrong. I think if you are clever in the design of your policy, you can actually encourage both. And I would argue that both stronger environmental assets and more innovation and higher productivity growth are both essential in the long run if you want what you might call a sustained and progressive prosperity. Second point I would make is that I think we need to recognize that economic incentives matter. I would not argue, I don't argue, that economic incentives are the only thing that matters. Some economists do, I don't. But I think it would be naive to not recognize, especially over time, that economic incentives, through the price system or through the tax system, have tremendous influence on people's behaviors. And there are many examples. They're all around us. We could talk about special incentives to promote saving. We could talk about tax incentives for corporations to invest. We can talk about eco-subsidies. There are good examples of these. There are bad examples of these. But make no mistake, economic incentives matter. The third point is really a question. So if you want a better economy and you want to take economic incentives seriously, then how do you use the economic incentives to get that better economy? Now, I think actually there are many answers to this. I think there are many pieces to the puzzle. But you won't be surprised, perhaps, to learn that I think that one piece, and a crucial piece of that overall puzzle, is a fundamental redesign of our fiscal structure. And I would say that at all levels of government. I think we should be redesigning our fiscal system at the municipal levels and at the provincial levels and at the federal levels. And in general, it's a very simple thing to say, tough to do in details, but in general, we should be prepared to impose user fees or taxes or whatever you choose to call them on various kinds of polluting activities. But at the same time, we should be prepared to lower taxes on the things that we want more of, which is probably both personal and corporate income. And I want to emphasize the point that either half of that package doesn't work. If you have the taxes or user fees on polluting activities, but not the other half, you'll get a greener economy, but you won't have a longer run, more prosperous economy. If you actually have the reducing taxes on personal or corporate income, you will probably have a more innovative and prosperous economy in the long run, but you won't have protected your environmental assets. You really need to do both halves of that package. And I think it will lead to both greener and more innovative economy, and there's a fair amount of evidence around the world that this is true. My final point is that none of this should be a partisan issue. I'm not saying that none of this is currently a partisan issue, but none of this ought to be, in a sensible world, a partisan issue. This is not about the scale of government. Now, we can be partisan about many things, but one thing that attracts a lot of partisan attention is about the size, the scale of government in the economy. We can pursue what I have just described as a fundamental redesign of the fiscal structure and leave the scale of government unchanged. We could have, at a different conference, a debate about whether we want a larger government or a smaller government, and we could have a good debate about that. You can be completely agnostic on the scale of government and still argue that we should be redesigning our tax system and our fiscal structure. And if this is a partisan issue, and if it remains a partisan issue, then I would argue that there's something wrong with our political system. Maybe you agree that there is something wrong with our political system, and we could have that debate. But let me just stop there, and I'm sure there will be some questions that follow on.
That indeed. So Tom Rand is the managing partner at the Mars Cleantech Fund and author of numerous books, most recently, Waking the Frog, Solutions for Climate Change Paralysis.
Thanks. So the perspective from which I speak is really one of an entrepreneur. I run a private fund, venture fund, partnered with Mars Discovery District in Toronto, Mars Cleantech. So it is one of these funny public-private partnerships. And I would certainly corroborate right off the bat a lot of what was said by the last speaker, that a legacy and infrastructure of basic research is fundamental to anything that one does in the venture community, and often unappreciated. So what my argument is, I think, there are breakthrough technologies coming out of Mars, and there are other places like us. Morgan Solar will be in the market this year with the lowest cost solar energy on the planet, 5 cents a kilowatt hour at scale. We have Woodland Biofuels who can produce cellulosic ethanol cheaper than the gasoline it replaces, so non-food source-based biofuels, cheaper than gasoline. Hydrostore, world's lowest cost grid-scale energy storage. None of those companies would be where they are without partnerships with some of the funds that are around, the public funds, SDTC and IDF, for example. So there's some follow-on funding aside from basic research that is absolutely fundamental. What's also missing in Canada, though, I think, and I don't know how to fully change this, but there isn't very much early-stage capital. So we've invested in Hydrostore. This company faces a market that our pipeline of opportunities is already in the $500 million range, and we haven't even put our first system in the water yet. So we have to make it work. But when that company gets to market, there are other pieces that need to come into play. EDC, for example, we hope will be there to back debt, because clean energy infrastructure is not like IT. It's not like you just take a disk and duplicate it. You're building real infrastructure, real assets. And venture funds like me can't do that. We just don't have that kind of scale. So what you need is project finance, and that's where someone like an EDC can come in, who spend the time getting to know a company, getting to understand the technical risks before the private sector gets involved. They sort of backstop loans and backstop performance warrants. So there are a lot of pieces that are already in play that are helping these companies, that are helping them get to market. Hydrostore wouldn't exist, I'll tell you now as an early investor, wouldn't exist without SDTC and IDF. They just wouldn't exist. So I hope, in a year or two from now, when I'm speaking to some of you again, we'll be pointing at, hundreds of millions of dollars of projects that we're building in this space. So the point of all that is to say something really fundamental, though. It's often been thought that clean energy requires, they use the word subsidy as if it was something negative, but they require some sort of government support, and that is the case, like any industry of any size, right? So I'm really corroborating something the last speaker said. But more importantly, there are now emerging companies that have clean energy assets that I argue are actually a better return than developing new oil and gas fields. So one of the questions that I ask, and one of the debates I'm looking forward to, that I have sort of in the coming next few months, is with the energy incumbents, right? What's the role of the energy incumbents? We've heard about ExxonMobil talking about revealing what their assets are. Well, the point of like revealing what your carbon risk is to say, if we stop at 2, we can burn a quarter of what we got. Let's be generous and say we're going to burn half. So that's a huge financial risk, and the pension funds and Carbon Tracker are beginning to make investors aware of that carbon bubble, right? That the value of fossil fuel company, if half your assets are unburnable because you'll lose the social license eventually to burn them, then your stock price should be half what it is, roughly. There's a discounted cash flow and all kind of stuff. But the point is there's a carbon bubble in our markets. So the private sector has tried its best to broadcast this risk to the markets, to say, if you're a pension fund and you're invested in the broad indices, TSX, for example, you have risk that is not, that is not on the books. It's not being accounted for. So the private sector is trying their best to make that known. I don't know if they're going to succeed or not. They're certainly not going to succeed in time to stop this carbon bomb. What's interesting is that you now still have energy incumbents, though, who are spending money to find new reserves that are I don't care whether you burn a third or a half or 3/4. Anything extra you're finding is 100% unburnable, right? So you're spending investors' money to increase carbon risk. So I make the argument, and there's a point to all this, I make the argument to energy incumbents, rather than spending money developing old assets, I've got technologies, other people have technologies that define a new class of low carbon assets that you need to find. So instead of drilling for new oil, you can spend exploratory money finding cellulosic ethanol plants that you can build. You can invest in solar companies that can develop solar plants. And the rate of return on those plants, here's the kicker, is better than the rate of return on an oil and gas field, and has longer long-term upside and much lower long-term risk. One would think that the energy incumbents, given that argument, would be jumping on this stuff, right? They're not. So it's a very specific kind of market gap that's interesting. So why aren't they? Is it just habits of mind? Is it just that we made a bunch of money yesterday doing that? We're going to do it the same thing today because you know, I'm 60 years old and I'm near retirement and my hand's on the lever of power, I'm not going to stick my neck out? Probably. It's probably a lot of those things. So the market isn't rational. And as much as smart people like Carbon Tracker want to point this out, you still have companies spending money to increase carbon risk and find 100% unburnable reserves. So how do you solve that problem? This is sort of, I'm framing the question. Well, for sure, a price on carbon is a big piece of it. There's shadow pricing already for many of these people, and it's still not really enough. Andrew Leach wrote a great article in Maclean's a couple of weeks ago that talked about what happens to an oil sands field if you have even minor carbon pricing, not in our market, but in the markets where you're selling that fuel, and it doesn't look good very quickly. But the market's not responding. So I think, you know, you need to clarify the price on carbon, for sure. I think you need to really step up and find other options for these guys, right? And it's mostly guys. The energy incumbents, some of them are actually trying to do something, right? The fossil fuel industry is not the enemy. The enemy is a fossil fuel industry that doesn't want to change, right? So an evolutionary view from an energy incumbent's point of view is to look at Cleantech to say, I'm going to find a way to lower the emissions intensity of my barrels of oil. Well, that's not going to solve our problem. What's a revolutionary approach in energy incumbent is to say, instead of lowering my energy intensity of my traditional fuel, I'm going to find a new fuel. As Mariana pointed out, you have to make it really easy for these guys to look for a new source of fuel. So for example, enhanced geothermal, I think, is the holy grail of clean energy. I think it can beat, hands down, carbon sequestration as a risk mitigation option. We put $3 billion in carbon sequestration. Why? Because the energy incumbents didn't even want to spend money to save their own butts, right? Which is what carbon sequestration is designed to do. So I think we need to sort of, I agree, we need to be really active and say, let's look, I don't care, let's look really hard at fusion, let's look really hard, let's give carbon sequestration a chance, let's give enhanced geothermal a chance. The market will figure out which one's the best one, and my bet is going to be enhanced geothermal. So I think there are a number of these pieces that we need to put into play. The punchline is, because we have to make it so easy for the energy incumbents to make the right decision. And unfortunately, yes, we have to incentivize them with profits to make the right decision, because that's how they act. That's just an empirical fact about business. Now, should they pay some of that back? Of course, that's a separate argument. But if we're going to accelerate the pace of clean energy development, we can't view the energy incumbents as an enemy. We can look upon them as bloated and lazy and overpaid and all the rest of it. That's fine. But if you think we can solve this problem without them, you're making a mistake. And so we have to figure out a way to extend a hand to these people and give them an option that's easy for them to do, right? And I think that's just, we got to swallow that bitter pill and, you know, let them be the heroes of the story, because we have a real problem to solve, and it doesn't matter who the hero is. What matters is that we solve the problem. So I'm interested in how we engage the energy incumbents. I'm not sure if we're going to succeed, but I think it's worth a try.
Excellent. Well, and the even bigger problem, perhaps, is that there are many state firms that, state-owned oil companies that are pouring state treasure into expanding out reserves, and so that will just be not a loss for the investors, but a loss for the countries as a whole. And so our final speaker, our panelist, is Bruce Lourie. He's the president of the Ivey Foundation. It's a private charitable foundation focused on environmental policy change. He has also co-authored several books with Rick Smith, including their most recent offering, which I saw out on a table out front, Talks In, Talks Out.
Great. Well, thanks very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here today, especially to be on a panel with such interesting perspectives. So my view is I guess, somewhat different in that, or I shouldn't say my view is different. My approach and understanding around where we need to go, perhaps, is a combination of the things that we've been hearing. So, and I just came from a large conference in Vancouver this week. There were like 9,000 corporate social sustainability people and NGOs from around the world. And everyone's talking about the similar themes. We need more capital investment in sustainable infrastructure. We need to increase clean tech investments. We need to foster innovation. We need to create greater equity. We need to internalize environmental costs. Like these are, it's not like we don't understand the things that need to be done. So the question for me is, what are the levers that we can use to try to facilitate and enhance those things and actually make them happen more rapidly. And I've boiled it down really to three things. There's institutions and social innovation. So when we talk about innovation, a lot of people, I think, are thinking of technological innovation. I think one of the single biggest challenges we face in Canada right now is the need for social and institutional innovation. And that, in my view, is often missed. So what are the roles, for example, of NGOs and of organizations that represent broader issues of social equity in our society that frankly aren't being included in the kinds of decisions that we need to be made? Second is around the need for clear and more stringent economic and environmental rules. And you know, as Chris pointed out, we need to be sending the economic signals. We need to make sure that we're not subsidizing things that we don't want. We need to look at where we can create incentives for things that we do want. And ultimately, this comes down to having clear policies and using our regulatory system in the way that it's meant to be used. And it is hugely outdated. The regulatory system in Canada, I'm not an expert on the tax system. Chris tells me our tax system is somewhat outdated. Certainly our environmental regulatory system is outdated in terms of how we deal with everything from energy to chemicals, et cetera. And then finally, there's the need for better measurements and better information. So right now, we are currently in a huge deficit around information gathering, and we're not even measuring the things we need to measure, and the things we're measuring, I would argue, we're not measuring correctly. And so if you look at those three things, institutional change, more stringent economic and environmental rules, and better measurements and accurate information, all three of those things are going in the wrong direction right now. So we need to reverse that kind of change. We need stronger institutions. I'm shocked, frankly. I work primarily on environmental issues, and if Canadians really understood, for example, what the changes to the Federal Fisheries Act will mean for Canada in the future, everything from tourism to outdoors to local businesses, frankly, to the future of our ability to feed ourselves. Like it's shocking what's going on. And the same, of course, goes with Statistics Canada and the loss of our ability to gather basic information. So I'm going to leave it with that and just say that we've got a serious need to really look at those three fundamental issues that, in my view, underlie the ability for us to enhance all the great things that the other panelists have talked about this morning.
Excellent. Thank you, Bruce. So I was just going to pose one question to the panelists and then open up the floor for questions because I'm mindful everyone would like to eat lunch. You have rumbling stomachs. And so the one thing that we have yet to talk about is the way in which we actually measure economic growth. And so this is a biggie, but we have been relying on GDP for the past 50 plus years. The creator of the GDP said when he made it, you probably shouldn't use this to measure a widespread economic growth and to design the economic policy for a country, and then we promptly did that. So that's not great. But so are we able to make this transition to a more sustainable economy with using the existing indicators for measuring economic growth, or is a new approach needed, some sort of hybrid where we have maybe natural capital reported on the side? What do you think, Claire?
Oh, I was going to defer to Chris on that.
All right, well, let's defer to Chris.
He looks like he's got a lot to say.
The creator of the statistics didn't say we shouldn't use them to measure growth. He said we shouldn't use them to measure well-being, and he's quite right. Economists have known forever that GDP measures or measures of GDP growth aren't measures of our overall well-being or happiness. Policymakers slip into it because it's easy and they're lazy. So GDP is a pretty good measure of what it was actually designed to measure, which is the value of goods and services flowing through a market. Now, what it doesn't do is measure our natural capital. So we want to do that separately. And you could even revise the GDP statistics so that when you actually cut down a tree, not only do you get the value of the goods and services that flow from the tree, but you take account of the fact that you've just destroyed an asset. You could do that. You probably should do that, okay? But don't get too many hate-ons for GDP. GDP's okay.
Excellent. Well, let's open up the floor to questions. Sir, on the left.
Thank you very much, Larry Russo with PSAC, not PSAC. You can call us the Alliance, which is way sexier too. But my question needs a little bit of a preamble. We are 0.5% of the world's population, occupying the second largest organized landmass in the world. Ever since the first colonists arrived here, it's always been about being drawers of water and hewers of wood. And I don't think I've heard this in all of the green stuff that we've heard today about our fundamental role in Canada. What is it? Are we drawers of wood and hewers of water and the rape, pillage, and plunder that is associated with that? Or are we guardians of wood and guardians of water, which means are we guardians of our natural resources? And let's listen to our Aboriginal sisters and brothers when we think about that. So how does that factor in? Because I've heard stuff about policies, I've heard stuff about regulations. We have a government that asks us that if you want to put in a regulation, you have to get rid of a regulation. That's the simplistic, mind-numbing crap that we're hearing from the current government, okay? So how do we deal with that? I think that the leadership has to say, what are we about before thinking, will EDC give me the capital for funding something, you know, which is about green, when we know that the current government is micromanaging every single federal government agency to the point where if you want to grow green, it's not going to happen. So I think that we have to have that conversation about what is it that the political and economic elites of this country, that struggle, what are we about and what are we going to be doing before we can even start thinking about policies and regulations and all the rest? Are we going to be guardians or are we going to be drawers?
So my take on, my argument on that would be, regardless of what government's in Ottawa, you can make one simple claim, which is that, you know, we're often told we're 2% of the emissions, so why even bother? Well, if we grabbed 2% of the global clean tech market, which is the stuff that preserves the natural environment, that's what clean tech is by definition, our clean tech industry would be bigger than our automotive sector, right? If we just get our pro rata share of this growing market, and in doing so, of course, we'll be building solutions that have to protect the natural environment. So I translate what you just asked to this government in economic terms, right? Regardless of what they think about climate change or natural resources, the world is going to decarbon. It's heading there. We know what that market's going to look like. Let's take 2% of it. We'll have more jobs in clean tech than we have in automotive right now. So that's how I connect those two to this government.
Bruce, do you have something to add?
Yeah, and I would just say that, well, first of all, for the government, they don't ever put in a new regulation when they take one out. They just take them out. But in terms of being hewers of wood and drawers of water, I think that is a fundamental challenge for Canadian society. And I think that we really need to have a vision for what is a society that we're looking for that isn't just about extracting resources and shipping them to other countries. And what's happening, and the reason why we're seeing the reduction in the regulations is that's just simply facilitating the ability to move raw resources offshore. And but that's my fear is that's something that's beyond just this government. This is a challenge we have in Canada.
Sir, on the right.
Yes, I'm Roger Peters with the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op. During the last 2 years, we've raised close to $2 million from ordinary Ottawa citizens to finance solar projects under the Ontario Feed-in Tariff program. What has kind of blown us away is the fact there's this huge potential for social financing of the green sector. Not just renewable energy, not just solar, but all green technology development. So I wonder if you had any views on how we can unlock this potential through government policy.
Well, the securities commissions in Canada are looking at that right now. They're talking to stakeholders, and they're planning on opening up crowdfunding for equity and for debt, and that's across all sectors. So they are looking at it. What I'd like to see is a higher cap. The cap's going to be $1.5 million, so that makes it hard on the project side. But they're certainly opening up crowdfunding and making it legal for unaccredited investors, i.e. not rich people, to invest in technology companies and projects.
About the federal government?
It's not a federal, I think it's a bunch of provinces who have jurisdiction over that, and they've gotten together and are now looking at, they're going to be done their consultations by June, so it's happening very quickly.
But there could be a federal role, I think, and I think in order to kind of unlock this nationally.
Sure, they could facilitate it, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sir, on the left.
Hi, my name is Brendan Haley. So the panel talked quite a bit about different clean technologies, which ones are cost competitive to the extent to which they are, how certain economic incentives could help out. But I really wanted to ask the panel, what about energy efficiency? Because energy efficiency is a technology that's cost competitive, right now. It only costs 3 cents to save a kilowatt hour. That's cheaper than natural gas. That's cheaper than coal. And so the reason we're not doing it doesn't seem to be about the cost. It seems to be about different types of institutional failures. We don't think of it like a fuel. Utilities don't have the right incentives. The private sector doesn't pick it up often because it's very disaggregated. So I'd like you to maybe cut into energy efficiency as an example of a technology that's cost competitive right now, but we're really not exploiting the potential that we could. So how do we do it, and why aren't we exploiting that potential?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And the starting point for any conversation about moving to a clean economy would be the massive adoption of energy conservation. I mean, we have the technology sitting on the shelf today to basically live our lives exactly the way we live them, using half of the energy that we currently use. So I'm involved a little bit in this in Ontario, and the Ontario government spends nearly $400 million a year on energy conservation, which one of the challenges is very few people know that. And you're exactly right, Brendan, it's 3 cents a kilowatt hour to save a kilowatt of energy in Ontario, and it's 2 to 3 to 4 times that to produce any kind of alternative electricity. So for me, it gets back to all of those the things that I was mentioning, like what are the kinds of social innovations that we need to enhance it, what are the policies that we need to get it out there, and what information do people need to understand that that's the kind of savings that we can get. So, and again, the federal government's really backed off the investments that we used to see in this area, but that is simply the smartest thing that we can be doing is to save energy.
And Chris?
Yeah, the question about energy efficiency is a great one because it brings to mind, I would say, the misallocation of much government policy. I don't know if you know about the McKinsey cost curve on carbon emission reductions, but if you look it up, Google it, it is a carefully assembled collection of where are the payoffs across different technologies for carbon emissions reductions. And the most efficient, the most cost-effective ways to reduce carbon emissions are the unsexy things. They are things like re-insulating your basement and buying more efficient refrigerators. These are deeply unsexy items, and because they are deeply unsexy, no government really wants to build a policy around them. What are the sexy things are the things that are incredibly expensive, like biofuel subsidies, and frankly, things like feed-in tariffs to finance wind power, which I think as a general rule are bad policies. But we have governments that, not surprisingly, because they're human and they kind of like to cut sexy ribbons and make nice announcements, their policy attention is drawn to the wrong end of the McKinsey cost curve. And I'd make a comment also about the previous speaker about the feed-in tariffs. I think there's a strong case to be made that changing the incentives that individual households and firms face through a tax is actually much more effective than doing it through subsidies like feed-in tariffs. we can much more easily identify what is the thing we're trying to avoid, which is carbon emissions. And it's much more difficult to identify the things we want to encourage, because there's a whole bunch of different ways to try to have less carbon emitting technology. The problem is governments don't know and never will know what is the best technology going forward. If you tax, you will actually create incentives for the private sector to come up with the best solution. If you actually give and stand ready to give subsidies in all kinds of different things, you politicize the process tremendously, and then you can count on most governments giving subsidies not where they are economically sensible, but where they're politically sensible or politically repugnant in many views. So that's my comment on that.
I think I would just add as well, you know, I mean, I think perhaps a slightly different perspective on some of those last things, where the energy efficiency dilemma is, I think, really an illustration of why, as much as, God, I love a carbon price, you know, a carbon price is a holy grail in so many ways, but it's also not sufficient, because a whole bunch of the energy efficiency technologies are cost competitive today. And yet there are other reasons why we don't do them. You know, why have we not invested in our own home energy retrofits? We know that saves us money, but we're busy people. We've got lots of other things to do. So there are other barriers that we need to overcome. And I think, Brendan, you alluded to some of them in the question. So we do need to be pretty active in countering some of those barriers. And I would absolutely agree. It's really unfortunate that the federal government has largely gotten out of that business. I think Chris is absolutely right about the sort of lack of sexiness associated with a lot of this stuff. A lot of people in this room who know more than I do about how to make issues politically saleable. But I would suggest one of the political upsides to energy efficiency, other than the sort of, yes, we all save money on our bills, which is pretty hard to argue with, there's jobs, right, associated with this that are local jobs by definition. You can't get that, you know, that person coming in to install your insulation from very far away. It's going to be local, and it's going to be diversified across the country. And so I think that is hopefully one of the things that can help to keep this on the political agenda.
Excellent. So we have 4 more questions, and you know, about 7 or 8 minutes. So let's try and keep it as brief as possible.
Yeah. My question actually was touched on by the economist just a moment earlier. It's more about the, you know, what went wrong in the Ontario experiment with the Green Energy Act and the price incentive that was provided through the feed-in tariff, and why didn't result in uptake of green energy as much as the similar program in Germany, for example, where the green energy now is close to 22% of the national energy production.
Well, one of the reasons it didn't have as much uptake, whether one agrees or disagrees about the price or the policy method, was that the utilities pushed back here, right? That there was a bottleneck on the amount of solar that was going to go on roofs, because utilities just did not want to deal with the instability that those solar panels brought. And when we first opened up the feed-in tariff for wind, the first cohort, which filled the transmission lines, was already in line from the RESOP program. So we just didn't have a responsive utility network to allow this to get in fast and to go up higher. One of the things that people like me hoped would happen was, when you get instability on the grid, you learn to solve those problems, right? Temporal powers, flywheels, smart energy sensors. There are very particular technologies that we are very good at developing here. We're not hewers of wood and drawers of water. We're actually a pretty high-tech society. And so those solutions to those problems would have provided really good long-term upside, because if we learn to solve them here, we'll export that technology, because everybody else will come across those problems sooner or later as well. And so what we're trying to do at Mars, for example, is we have a consortium of Capgemini and Siemens and Hydro One helping entrepreneurs get this stuff onto the grid. So the grid, in a way, the grid operators are less likely to have reputational risk, etc. We provide a safe place for them to try out these new technologies. So that was the pushback. And unfortunately, the big gains from the Green Energy Act, from an economic perspective, was not the green energy. It wasn't even making the panels. It was going to be addressing the problems and building the next generation technologies to deal with those problems. And we've still yet to do that work. That's still coming down the pipe. And I argue that's the long-term upside of that policy. that we've created some instability. Now let's do what we do really well. We have a great engineering culture in this province, and some technologies are coming down the pipe. So that's, I think, where the rubber hits the road, solving those instabilities. Why didn't it get picked up as fast as it could? Because our utilities, for their own good reasons, pushed back and said, I don't want those instabilities on my grid.
Excellent. Sir?
Two questions around the carbon pricing issue, which I'm certainly in favor of doing that. There is the issue of to what extent Canada should proceed independently of the US and other countries. And it does seem to me if we were to introduce significant carbon pricing in Canada ahead of the US, if we chose to do that, for which there's good reason, there would be some significant adjustment difficulties on the part of some industries which compete mainly in the US market. So if you follow that chain of logic, it seems to me part of the proceeds from any carbon pricing would have to go into helping accommodate that adjustment. If that's the case, then you sort of get away from the sort of clean story of just saying we carbon price but sort of rebate back to households in the form of lower personal taxes. So we're doing, we're taxing bads, but we're giving people back money. So I guess the question is, if we introduce carbon pricing independently of Canada of a global initiative, don't we have to sort of devote part of the revenues on the adjustment side, so we wouldn't be able to fully rebate back on the tax side as Chris advocated?
Is that for me?
Claire? Talk about that.
I don't claim to know the answer to that question. I do think that obviously there is a global problem, and it's not just that Canada should have a system ultimately that is integrated with the US system, but presumably we should have a world system that is integrated, that is coherent. So I guess I would advocate on the carbon front that Canada at least start thinking seriously about designing some form of carbon price. And if the US is not going to act, then I think there are ways to deal with the border issues. I don't think they're simple. I'm not sure that it prevents you from offsetting the carbon price with tax reductions elsewhere. I'm not sure that it prevents you from doing that. But at the same time, whatever Canada does, whether we do something unilaterally or something that is integrated eventually with the US system, I think we should also be pushing ahead on the multilateral discussions rather than being sort of passive-aggressive obstructionist, which is, I think, a reasonable description of how we've been for the last few years.
All right, so for the last two questions, let's hear both of them, and then we'll wrap up from there.
Thanks. I just had a question around how the rise and fall of oil and gas prices in Canada impacts the development of clean energy sector in Canada. So, for example, low oil and gas prices make tar sands development less profitable, but at the same time, oil and gas then is much cheaper compared to perhaps new types of renewables. But when oil and gas prices go up, you can see more competitive scale there, but at the same time, the development of things like the tar sands becomes much more profitable. So could you maybe touch on the tension between the two, and if there's a preferred point for the growth of a clean energy sector in Canada?
And then Ms. Berman.
Thanks, Jeremy. Sephora Berman. I've talked with many of you about the need for progressives to stop trying to fight bad projects with policy recommendations, that we need to start fighting infrastructure with infrastructure, to start getting concrete. They talk about pipelines and a specific number of jobs, and we talk often generically about windmills and butterflies. And it seems to me like we need to pick. So I guess in your last minutes, I'm asking you to pick. If we're going to rally around projects in this country where we say it will create this many jobs and it would push the country in the right direction, what is it? Where is it? What does it look like? Thank you.
Excellent. Well, let's address that question first, the idea of where our focus should be put on.
So I'll start with cellulosic ethanol. We have an enormous amount of agricultural and forestry waste in this country. I also argue that people like Woodland Biofuels can build plants that generate better IRRs than a new oil and gas field. The amount of cellulosic ethanol we can build in this country, we could go full tilt and put more capital into cellulosic ethanol for the next 20 years than we're planning on putting into the tar sands, and we still wouldn't run out of cellulosic biomass. So that's one good option. I have others. But I agree with you entirely that creating an alternative, saying here's a project we can build that generates profits, that hires workers, that generates scalable amounts of energy, so it's not kid stuff, is exactly what we need to put in front of the energy incumbent and say, stop getting around, you've got an option. Because right now they're saying, I don't see an option that scales. So I think that's exactly our challenge.
Bruce?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question, Zipporah. I really think that we are going to, in the future, see a much more electrified society. And in order to facilitate that and to get to some of the questions that Tom raised, is investing in smart grids in Canada. And so it's a stronger, it's a major national infrastructure investment that comes right down to the local level that involves a lot of new technology that facilitates storage, facilitates bringing on new kinds of technology, and helps us reduce our reliance on fossil fuels.
Excellent. So let's have a quick answer to the second last question, which was about the impact of fuel price volatility.
That's yours.
There you go, Claire.
Well, it's a really great question. It's a tricky question. I mean, we've seen globally, and arguably in Canada to some extent as well, that tension in terms of low natural gas prices competing with renewables very directly, and that is a problem. I think, to me, in terms of what happens in oil sands investment, and Tom alluded to Andrew Leach's research on this, if we see low oil prices and low oil demand, we see a lot less oil sands investment. What do we fill that space with, is I think the real question that we've been talking about here. I wanted to quickly talk very fast about Canada and the US, because that's something we spent a lot of time talking about in this country. We have the same climate target as the US. They have a plan to meet it, we don't. But I would argue in a lot of ways, of course, we need to look at the US. It's inherent in being a Canadian, we look at the US. But the reality is we have very, very different emission profiles in our countries. Our sources of electricity are very different. We have the oil sands, they don't. So in a lot of ways, we actually can't look to the US reflexively to solve our climate problems. We can't look to them to design the policies that we need. Of course, we harmonize where it makes sense. But we are going to need to take our own approach. And I think the roundtable, for example, the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy has done a lot of research on how we can afford to move more quickly. I think absolutely, as Chris pointed out, there are areas where we're going to need to think through the border questions, and that ultimately does need to be global. But I think we don't need to see the US as either the limit, the ceiling, the barrier, any of those things, because we are going to need to come up with something that works for our own system.
Chris,
just want to come back to Zipporah's question about infrastructure. So I actually don't know what the single green infrastructure piece is, if I'm allowed to vote for one. But I want to come back to Bruce's expression about institutional infrastructure. So my infrastructure choice is, let's change the fiscal structure, let's get the incentives more sensible, much more sensible than they are now, so that the private sector can then take greener actions than they are taking now. On physical infrastructure, though, it's not particularly green, but I'd like bridges and overpasses that aren't falling down in Montreal. So, Zipporah, if you can do anything about that, I'd appreciate that.
Well,
I'll take that too.
There you go. Well, thank you so much to our panel, and let's eat.